Justin Wolfers, welcome back to the show.
I'd like to say it's a pleasure, Preet. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
There's a lot going on. It is, I believe, Friday, April 11th. We're recording this. We note the time and the date because lots could happen between now and the time people listen to this. So let's get right into it. There was a tariff policy put in place, exorbitant tariffs on a lot of countries. There was a pause on that some time ago. Then he put them into full effect. The stock market cratered. You can describe the scope of that cratering if you would like. And then a day ago, he paused on his grand plan to bring manufacturing back to America. His grandiose ambitions were paused. Why did he blink, Justin? Was it because the stock market was tanking? Was it because the bond market was tanking? Was it because people were whispering in his ear, this is going to be a problem for him? Or, as some people suggest, this was the overall strategy right from the start? Which of those, or pick your own?
Okay, so I think you said, let's walk through the history of this and just lay out some facts. All the way back in January of 2025, the United States had very low tariffs, around about 1 to 2%. Actually, so did almost all of the rest of the world. Basically, over the last many, many decades, there's been tremendous trade liberalization, and almost all of our trading partners had tariffs of 1 to 2%. So close, it's almost zero. Then the president got elected. He decided to beat up on Canada and Mexico. He decided not to, decided to do it again, decided not to. We went through that dance. And then all of 9 days ago on Wednesday, Liberation Day, the president all of a sudden announced what he called reciprocal tariffs on the rest of the world, but were no such thing. If you want a reciprocal tariff, you'd have to figure out how much the other side was putting tariffs on you, and you'd make your tariffs reflect that.
But that was not the formula. Formula was rather trade imbalance with respect to goods.
Right. So the formula, I'm happy to dig deeper, but let me just say every professional economist on earth says was absurd, insane, incoherent, bizarre. It led to very high tariffs on very poor nations, much lower tariffs in some. Israel, which had no tariffs on the United States, got a 17% reciprocal tariff. So this was just utterly incoherent. The reception of these tariffs was wildly negative. The stock market fell 12, 13, 14% over the next couple of days. That's huge because realize the stock market had already priced in what it expected the Trump tariffs to be.
Well, how could they do? Could we just pause on that? How could the stock market price that in if no one, including Trump and his staff, really have any clue what the hell he's going to do?
Right. So when people are buying and selling stocks, they're taking their best guess as to how profitable American companies will be in the future. That's their underlying model. And then they're thinking to themselves, what could go wrong? And they realize we'd elected a protectionist president who ran on tariffs. And so as they were thinking about how profitable American business was likely to be, they were almost certainly thinking about what sorts of tariffs they would expect. And they probably expected tariffs around about 10, 11, 12%. There's a bunch of Wall Street analyst notes that suggest that's what was going on. So they've just got their best guess. Of course, no one knows, but it's best guess. The point I wanted to make there, Preet, is the enormous stock market meltdown was not to the entirety of the tariffs. It was actually just to the unexpected part. If they already expected 2/3 of what they got, that means the stock market reaction was just to 1/3 of the tariff, which is another way of saying this is an enormous reaction. This is telling you just how allergic markets are to tariffs. But it tells your listeners something more important, which is when people are buying stocks, that's a bet on the future profitability of American companies. And the market believed that the future profitability of American companies would be enormously lower under the Liberation Day tariffs.
Can we pause for another second just so we understand something? And I think this is crucially important. One of, if not the most important goal for Donald Trump, as he stated, which you can believe in an extreme universe is, I guess, theoretically possible, right? That we want to bring jobs to America, that we want to increase manufacturing at home. And the way to do that is to tariff these foreign countries and their products so that it will be too expensive for Americans to buy them. So that manufacturing will come here. As a friend of mine said to me recently, based on all the dynamics and the economics, there's no universe in which an American company is going to build a reading glasses factory in America. Putting that aside for a moment, the only basis on which you can decide to do something like that, to bring manufacturing jobs here that otherwise exist in other countries, is to plan. And it takes some years. It's not on a weekly or a monthly horizon. It takes 2, 3, 4, 5 years, depending on nature of the industry. That requires some certainty about whether or not those tariffs are going to remain in place. So even on the extreme theory of, you're smiling, I think I'm a good student of yours. So even under the extreme theory of Donald Trump, the only way that goal, which is the promise that he's held out to his MAGA base and millions of Americans, jobs are going to come back here, only works, right? If you sufficiently incentivize people to bring jobs back here. And he is now, am I correct that he has now proven not only that they can't count on what the tariff situation is going to be in 3 or 4 or 5 years, but they can't count on what the tariff situation is going to be in 3 or 4 or 5 days. In what universe now, having walked back from the brink, is there any prospect, even on the extreme Trump theory, of those manufacturing jobs coming to the United States?
So that is the first reason this won't work. It takes 3 or 4 years to build a factory. That factory would then be around for several decades. So therefore, the most important variable for the companies trying to decide whether to build a factory is not today's tariff rate. It's the expected tariff rate from, let's say, 2030 to 2060.
Okay, so today, Justin, what can a reasonable person expect that tariff number to be? Or am I correct that it's unknowable?
Nothing's unknowable. We economists are forced to make best guesses, right?
Assumptions, yes. Assume you have a can opener.
It's not an assumption. A guy is thinking about building a factory. He or she has to take a best guess. That's how businesses work.
Yeah.
But what is your best guess for the US tariff rate in the year 2040? Mine's 0 or 1%, maybe 2%.
But as part of what I'm trying to get at is, what has the topsy-turvy nature of Trump's tariff policy this week done to your and others' expectations of the tariff rate in 2040 or 2030?
It's made it clear that these tariffs are not going to stick.
Okay.
And what that then means is that we're going to get all the costs of the Trump tariffs, right? We're going to have to pay more. We're going to have to look for new trading partners. We've destroyed our soft power, on and on and on and on. All the costs you've ever thought of. Trump's theory of the case was that there were benefits that were worth it. The benefits were factories returning home. So 2 points on that. One, because he hasn't done the hard work of trying to get this through Congress, win the argument, convince Democrats, or even convince the rest of the Republican Party, he hasn't changed expectations of long-run tariffs. And so therefore, we're not going to get any of the benefits of these tariffs. We're going to get all the costs and none of the benefits.
So, okay. So I keep saying let's pause on that because it's just so interesting and important. Tomorrow or the next week or the week after that, when Donald Trump or a Trump official says with a straight face, this is all in service of bringing jobs back to America, it's all about improving the manufacturing situation in America. Am I correct that based, before this week, but certainly based on this week, as you point out, the lesson of this week is that is utter and complete bullshit.
It is. And I want to go a step further for your listeners, because in the current
environment... You're going to go beyond bullshit?
I want to make it clear that this is not Preet and Justin agreeing.
Yeah.
In the current environment, you can find a talking head on TV or in a podcast who'll say anything. And the deeper question you want to ask is it true? And so this is why I started by talking about stocks. Because stocks is people betting millions and billions of dollars based on very sophisticated modeling and as much information as they can get a hold of. And they're betting on the future of American businesses. Now, there is an old expression, the stock market's not the economy, and that's correct. But any gains to the American economy from Trump's tariffs run through the profitability of American businesses. And so this is a case where if it's not even making large American businesses more profitable in expectation, that says we don't see extra profitability from doing business in America. We don't see this expansion. We see the opposite. We see turmoil and problems getting hold of raw ingredients and separating us from the global economy and incompetence and incoherence. And we don't want this. So it's not Preet and Justin saying there's no benefits from this. It's also all of the informed money on Wall Street saying this is going to hurt American business. And that's before we talk about how much it's going to hurt American consumers.
So can we just go back to my friend's reading glasses analogy? Can you explain why it is the case that we won't build such a factory here, and why that's not a bad thing, and why that doesn't hurt us in connection with our relationship to other countries?
So the first thing, if reading glasses are currently made in China, the 145% tariff on China might actually be sufficiently high that you may not want to buy your reading glasses in China. Although, to be honest, in some products, you still right. Might be better.
But then you buy them from Vietnam or from India. But in what circumstance do they come to America?
Right. You're always one step ahead of me, Preet. That's right. So they're just going to buy them from Vietnam. Because the labor differential, the labor cost differential is just so gigantic and enormous. But more than that, realize that in the current moment, the United States is awfully close to full employment. I think it's 4.2% unemployment rate. Basically, everyone who wants to find a job can. So that means if we want more people to work in manufacturing, we want fewer of them working in other things. And so then the question is, why do we want people screwing in screws on glasses rather than doing other things, rather than writing software, rather than doing engineering, rather than teaching kids in classrooms and so on? There's certainly an appeal to those who lived through the 1950s. It's not me, who enjoyed the fact that manufacturing built the American middle class during the 1950s, and people look back to that with a certain reverence. But this is actually just the way economic development works. 100 years ago, we were having actually the same debate, but it was because we're moving from the land, from a predominantly agricultural economy to a manufacturing-based economy. And we moved from an enormous share of the population working in agriculture to working in manufacturing, and that raised the American middle class. And there was a lot of nostalgia. Why aren't we back on the land? And the subsequent stage of economic development is we move out of the factories and we move and become engineers and computer scientists and software designers. And we're in a much more cognitive economy. And we are not inhaling black soot in our mines or in our factories during the day. And that's the future of the American economy. And it's one that speaks well to the skills that Americans have. We're the most educated workforce in the world. And so presumably the jobs of the future are those, the jobs we want are those that cater to the extreme productivity and education of American workers.
I just want to emphasize this point again. Maybe I'm belaboring it, but I apologize. When in a week or in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks, a listener watches a Trump official or Trump himself talk about how his grand plan to bring back jobs to America is in full swing because of these sort of, 10% or thereabouts tariffs on all these other countries, and a huge tariff on China. When they spout that and talk about this dream of certain manufacturing jobs coming back to America, what should the journalist who's interviewing that official say, do, or push back on, if anything?
Okay, so the first thing is actually the odds of a recession are awfully high. So a big chance is that he's not going to be boasting about the numbers. Now, that doesn't matter because what the White House does instead is tell stories. And he's very good at this. He'll find a factory somewhere that says it's going to raise employment, and he brings that person out to the Rose Garden and they have a conversation. The first thing is a journalist literally should not talk to any CEO in America right now. Now, that sounds absurd, but let me explain. The thing about the tariffs is this consolidates power in the White House. And in the first Trump administration, when he imposed tariffs, he literally carved out hundreds of exceptions for individual companies and individual markets. And he's shown a willingness to do so. He already did so with the big three automakers a couple of weeks ago. So what that means is that any CEO worth their salt cannot be on the public record criticizing the Trump administration. Instead, what they're going to be is down at Mar-a-Lago on bended knee asking the king for a handout.
And by the way, they love that phrase, bend the knee. They're using that phrase with respect to something more in my wheelhouse, the executive orders and settlements with all the law firms. They love to, which is an interesting thing because in negotiations generally, sorry about the tangent, but in negotiations generally that I'm aware of, including settlements with the government, when I was U.S. attorney, I never said about a settling company that we investigated, they bent the knee. When company A and company B engage in a merger, nobody says they bent the knee. It's a very interesting art of the deal approach after the fact to say about your counterpart, they bent the knee. But I guess it's worked for him so far.
Well, I don't think it has. And I don't think it works for the American
ironic,
people.
Yeah.
So let's follow that tangent just for a moment. You'll bring us back to what you want to talk about. But this performative masculinity actually has terrible economic implications. The most obvious example is Canada. This nonsense of calling Canada the 51st state and referring to the Canadian Prime Minister as governor and implicitly threatening to invade has, I've spent a lot of time talking to Canadians, angered the Canadians at a very, very deep and fundamental level. And that has made it very difficult for Canadian politicians to strike a deal. You've made it like the voters don't want them to bend the knee. And that hurts Americans because trade with Canada is really important. I'm coming to you from Michigan. We've got auto plants right around the corner from me that rely for their inputs on Canada. And if we can't strike good deals with Canada, that's really bad for the manufacturing middle-class workers of Michigan.
Can we indulge in a couple of other metaphors?
Let's do it, brother.
The MAGA people, so I tweeted last night in a reference to what Donald Trump said about President Zelensky of Ukraine. I said, Donald Trump didn't have the cards, right? And I don't think he does. So I got a lot of responses to that from people who did showed a screenshot of the market, the Dow and the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ up on the day he paused, making the argument that this was all part of the game plan. This was all, three-dimensional chess and everything else. Somebody made the analogy, I think it was Chris Hayes, but I may be getting that wrong, saying it was like a guy decides to burn down his house, has a change of heart as it's burning, douses out the fire, and now he's got a partially burnt house. Great work. Does that analogy hold, or are the MAGA people correct?
I mean, it holds quite precisely. And in fact, the day after that, markets woke up and realized actually that he hadn't saved that much of the house after all. And yesterday, stocks fell and about half of that optimism went away. So there's literally no question that the president's actions to date have destroyed trillions of dollars of value.
But if, in fairness to the other side, if by Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, if the market goes back to the level it was at 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we're back at the status quo, market-wise, what has been the harm? Right down the middle for you, right across the plate for you, Justin.
The United States has shown itself to be an unreliable trading partner.
Yeah, but that's very amorphous. How does that translate into actual bad things?
Well, it translates into, I want you to put yourself in the mind of any CEO of any company you can think about. Think about, someone who is thinking about building an auto plant in Michigan. One of the great benefits of being here actually is access to wonderful inputs from Canada. But we can no longer rely on that because being allowed to trade across this invisible line is now up and down with the whims of the president. And I'm worried that if I invest in that factory, it's no longer, it may not turn out to be a profitable investment. I want to go back and give an economics lesson if I may, but I'm going to do it in a very simple way.
Please.
The fundamental problem of the Trump administration is that President Trump comes at the world with a zero-sum perspective, which probably makes sense for real estate developers. So his understanding is, I win, you lose. Therefore, it's sufficient to make someone else lose for me to win. And in some domains, that's true. But the study of international trade, and in fact, all of economics, is actually about something far more beautiful. It's about cooperation. I sat down last night and I looked at my dinner plate. And my dinner plate contained quinoa that some farmer in Peru graciously grew for me. It contained vegetables that were not in season in the United States. And someone on the other side of the world decided that Justin might enjoy this. And I don't understand why he and his family were so thoughtful, but they grew it and they sent it on a ship around the world for me. I drank a beer that came from Germany because Germany makes wonderful, wonderful beers. And somehow they knew exactly the type of Pilsner that I felt like. Of course, it was an IPA. I'd buy American. But for a Pilsner, I'm pretty comfortable. And like, what a beautiful miracle. And that miracle of cooperation is each of those folks is specializing at the thing they're best at, right? Peru is much better at growing quinoa than the United States is. And in return, I specialize in the thing that I'm best at. I'm a terrible cook, Preet. I'm a terrible farmer. I actually went to an agricultural high school, but I can't grow vegetables to save my life. So what I do instead is I go to work every day and I teach students, but I teach students from all around the world. And so I do more of what I'm good at and they do more of what they're good at. And I enrich their lives and they enrich my lives. This is the beauty of cooperation. So markets look like competition, but what they're really doing is facilitating cooperation. And the pie's getting bigger and I'm getting better off and they're getting better off. And what's happening right now is Washington is walking straight through the middle of my arrangement with that Peruvian farmer and my arrangement with that Australian student who came over to learn from me and saying, I think this is somehow bad for us. I want you to stop. And it's making us all worse off.
What do you think of the nature of the China tariffs? And again, going to this prospect of bringing manufacturing jobs back to America, it's politically more palatable, right? It's easy to be anti-China. The Democrats are, the Republicans are. Is that going to persist? And what can China do in reaction? We all hear about the negative things that we think China does to us and the trade imbalance. And now that he's ratcheted back all the other tariffs, but increased on China, what does that mean for the average person in this country?
Yeah, China's a great question to ask because it's the only one. It's the only thing here that's difficult. I think intervening in America's trade with Australia, with Canada, with Mexico, with Vietnam, it clearly makes everyone worse off. There are more subtle arguments about China. There are certainly some ways in which China is a bad actor in international trade. It doesn't do enough to respect, for instance, American intellectual property rights. I was told yesterday, someone said, well, boy, these got China's attention. That will bring them to the table. I have a pretty good intuition that if President Trump just wanted to call, they probably would have taken his call. You don't actually need a 145% tariff rate to get noticed. So I think it's a clumsy way forward. I think, how will it affect yours and my lives? Look, our economy is deeply integrated with that of China. In some ways, for very, very good. Ask your parents how many toys they had when they grew up. My mother told me she had like 3 or 4. They were wooden toys. My kids have a whole toy room.
We had the same number of toys as we had channels on TV.
Yes.
Very few.
And now my kids have 100 channels and 200 toys.
Well, you're a wonderful, indulgent father, obviously.
I'm certainly an indulgent one. But that's because of trade with China. And yes, some of them are plastic and crappy, but gee, I tell you what, my mum wishes she grew up with the toy room that my kids have. So we really benefit. Look at the clothes you wear. Look at how many shirts you own compared to how many shirts your grandmother owned. Your grandmother probably owned like 4 shirts. So we are better off. No question. There are very complicated geopolitical issues with China, and many of them are well above my pay grade. But I do just want to recognize trade with China does benefit Americans.
So it sounds like you're saying that there's a reasonable argument for a substantial tariff on China. A, what should that be? Or B, should it be targeted to certain products?
So we want some strategic engagement. What's the smartest form of it? You know, I don't think I'm the best guy in the world to answer that, but basically what you do is you target a few strategically important things, right? In the same sense that if on the Chinese side, they would target things like rare earth minerals, you would target things that would have the greatest political cost in China that makes it clear to them that our economies are integrated in ways that help both of us, and you'd work together to try and sort this stuff out, and you're either going to succeed or you're not. I do want to suggest one other really big concern. This is not a global trade war. This is an American trade war. So the US has reduced the amount of trades with the rest of the world. That's what the 10% tariffs will do, and almost eliminated trade with China. That doesn't cut China off from the rest of the world. So the Australians are looking for places to sell their beef. If the Americans don't want it, or if they want to add tariffs, which makes it harder to sell, I reckon they might be selling it to China. And so what you're going to end up doing is pushing the rest of the world closer to China, which from a geopolitical perspective is probably a bad idea. So our influence in the world declines. And then I just want to share with your listeners one idea that I have no evidence for, but I've always been very sympathetic to. Much of the global trading system was set up in the post-World War II era, where the view was if we form relationships of mutual independence, where we work together, where we each make each other better off, where as part of those trading relationships we visit each other and get to know each other, that would make war more expensive. We stand to lose more anytime we go to war with a country now, because we'll probably also lose those close trade agreements. And we know those people. We've looked them in the eye.
But on the flip side, that's an interesting point you make. On the flip side, sort of, I've heard the argument that one reason we need to be self-sufficient with respect to some things, like steel and aluminum and other things that help to make the materials of warfare, we can't possibly be interdependent. We must be self-sufficient, because who wants to go to war if we can't make the tanks ourselves? Isn't that a fair argument?
Sure. So then let's meet in the middle, which is let's form close bonds of reciprocity on all products except those necessary to go to war. By the way, you're then going to hit a Washington problem, because that's called the national security argument for tariffs. And it says that we should have specific tariffs aimed at what matters for national security. The problem with that is you literally have had watchmakers in Washington arguing that the American production of watches is critical to national security.
But it doesn't take away the fundamental premise if argued in good faith.
If argued in good faith, you just want to narrow it. It doesn't say that you want tariffs on manufacturing, because why would we want tariffs on leather saddles, right? Unless we're going to war on horses.
Yeah. So targeting...
and the other thing... So it's national security is not all of manufacturing. It's only a small slice. And it's not just manufacturing. So let me ask you this. Would you rather that we have a robust manufacturing sector, or that we have the world's smartest people working on artificial intelligence and machine learning and all sorts of these tools that can enable us to get a step ahead or to better guide our missiles and so on?
I mean, whatever would produce a better quality of life for Americans and more wealth and prosperity for all Americans. And my guess is that's the second.
Right. And also that those things have enormous defense implications as well. The point is, national security ain't defense, and defense ain't national security.
But as a political matter, so that was a good question you asked, and I answered, I think, in good faith. But I'm also I don't make goods. I provide services, whether it's speaking on a podcast or representing a client in a matter or a case in court. And that's a whole separate issue, why we're divorcing services from goods in this whole tariff complicated issue. If you make this argument and present that question to a lot of people who have lost jobs, or to communities where manufacturing jobs have been lost, how do you expect them to answer? And is it crazy for them to answer differently?
No.
So politically, it's more thorny, right?
Absolutely. So let me be crystal clear about that. I am making the argument that tariffs on average tend to be terrible for the country as a whole, but there are some winners along the way. But I do want you to notice that incoherent tariffs, so you would expect, who are some of the winners? Actually, it's going to be the American businesses who are protected from foreign competition. But what we've actually seen is the stock prices of those very companies have been falling. So
why is that?
Incoherent tariffs cut us off. And the other thing to realize is, it's not that you can just look at a sector and say, hey, this sector competes with China, therefore we should protect it, because that sector is also incredibly reliant on the rest of the world for its inputs. It turns out if you want to help the American auto industry, do not put tariffs on aluminium and steel, right? Because they're important inputs.
Can I mention, so there's protecting industries that exist, There's also trying to bring back defunct industries. So
why would you do that?
Well, so that's my question. So I mentioned the example of the reading glasses, which, is sort of a frivolous one. But there's another thing that we all use and we all love. If you're of a certain age and you still believe in the television set, the great flat screen television sets. I have one that I'm looking at right now out of the corner of my eye. This was true at least fairly recently. Maybe I've missed something. But the U.S. stopped making TVs a long time ago. Am I right? Maybe there's one company. It used to be just Zenith. Is there an argument for bringing back the manufacturer of televisions to the United States or not?
I can't think of one. So let me be really clear on this. The quality of televisions has never been higher. The price of televisions has never been lower. The democratic access to televisions has never been greater. Working class families have multiple televisions and get to enjoy all sorts of entertainment that once would have been only in a king's palace. I think this is wonderful.
What about the jobs?
They're gone. Those workers who used to have television manufacturing skills.
I guess what I'm asking for is, these are all great answers and they're very smart and they seem totally right to me. But as a political matter, and a lot of this is about politics, we're going to talk about whether the Senate, before I let you go, and the House can do anything about this tariff authority on the part of one man who's the president of the United States. If you're from a community, I keep going back to these communities where they've lost manufacturing jobs, how do you explain to them in a way that they will understand is in their self-interest? And maybe it's not. Look, there are winners and losers in the economy, right? As AI gets to be a bigger deal, certain jobs are lost. As the green economy gains steam, coal jobs are lost. And maybe your answer is a heartless, I'm sorry, that's the brakes.
No. There's actually one word that's separating us right now.
What?
Okay. If you were talking about a community with dying, still occurring industries, they would definitely want something to help prop up that industry, right? You might think about US autos like that. If you're talking about a community with dead industries, those workers the town's gone. Those workers now have developed they have new jobs. There's no one sitting around thinking, I have developed the perfect skills for making large TVs and I'm waiting for someone to call. That already happened. That's in the past. Let bygones be bygones. But Preet, I think I'm pretty well qualified to speak to the question you're in. I live in Michigan. We manufacture autos. American-made cars are not American-made. So it's not that people in Michigan go out to the fields and dig up the ingredients to make autos. That's how farming works. That's not how manufacturing works. Manufacturing, we import the raw materials. Sometimes we import car doors, sometimes car seats. There is no rubber grown in the United States. It's literally impossible, therefore, for there to be a purely American-made car. If we put prohibitive tariffs on rubber, you would destroy the American auto industry. So the thing to understand is these tariffs, on one hand, protect and another hand, punish. Realize, and steel is actually where the rubber hits the road here. Oh, wow, rubber.
Nice
again.
Work, rubber.
Yeah,
and
sorry
road.
about that. Steel, which is basically, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny industry that is used throughout the rest of manufacturing. And so what you end up doing is you save a tiny number of jobs, but you cost thousands of other jobs elsewhere. Let me pedal back out of all this. I'm going to channel my better half, Betsy Stevenson. She has a way of talking about this. She says, yes, there are 13 million Americans who work in manufacturing, and they're really important, and we value them. There are 140 million Americans who work elsewhere. And holding the work that 140 million people do hostage in order to slow the rate of decline of the 13 million has efficiency and equity implications. And I feel for the pain and I'm all in on helping it, but I don't think tariffs are the answer.
Can I go back to my original question?
Let's do it.
Why did Donald Trump blink this week?
No one knows. But I'm first of all going to point out it's actually fantastic news because 4 days ago, everyone was really worried that this was a guy who'd stay the course, even with a disastrously terrible policy that was about to plunge the United States into a recession. So the fact that we learned that he has enough humility to walk it back
You think it was
Perhaps if you-
humility?
Perhaps if you
That was
pair
a
it
very
with a
interesting
side dish of
assessment
punching China.
by non-psychology professor Justin Wolfers.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think, look, the Treasury Secretary who offered him a side dish of punch China harder made the whole dish a little more palatable.
Well, can you explain the bond market issue? Because there are people who are reporting stock market is one thing, but when the bond market started to go kaboom, that really freaked people out. And A, is that true? B, should it have freaked people out? And C, do you think that was the cause for Donald Trump to blink?
I'm not sure if it's the cause. I think it's the least interesting of those questions. But let's talk bond market so that your listeners understand what's happening and is still happening. Okay. So first of all, what is the bond market? It's where the United States government goes to borrow money. Same way you and I borrow money from a bank. No bank has enough trillions of dollars to lend to the US government. So therefore, what the US government does is it says, I'm going to give you this piece of paper, and if you give me $100 for it, I'll give you $105 in a year's time. So you can see that's just borrowing money and offering to pay interest. And that $5 differential you'd think of as being the interest rate. The most important bonds the US government issues is not that it'll pay you back in 1 year, but that it'll pay you back in 10 years. So therefore, that's how the US government borrows. And one of the great things about being American is everyone in the world believes the most safe asset in the world, has believed the safest asset in the world is US government bonds, which is to say, if you're going to put your money anywhere, lend it to the US government and get a little bit of interest. That's actually safer than putting it under your mattress because it won't get burnt in a house fire. And we all know the US economy is incredible and the US government is totally credible. They'll definitely pay you back. And because of those because people believe that, we pay very low interest, much lower than other governments, on our government debt. What happened this way, and then what normally happens is when the world becomes a more dangerous, worrying, uncertain place, people buy more government bonds, which is to say they're willing to accept an even lower interest rate from the US government.
For security.
Because they value that security. And what happened this week is the world became a more complex, dangerous, worrying, volatile place. And they did the opposite. They started saying, if I'm going to lend money to the US government, I'm going to charge you a little more because I don't trust you. And that's the big, so there's two things come out of that. One is a signal. Global markets, people all around the world, no longer believe that investing in the United States is the safe bet that it once was. They're worried about us. The second thing is, this actually has a direct effect on you and I and our listeners, which is, it's just like, if you ever done the calculations of what would my monthly mortgage payment be if the bank raised the interest rate by 1/4 percentage point, it's awful. Turns out you need to spend a whole lot more money paying for your mortgage. Well, this is just like that, except we're talking about trillions of dollars, not thousands of dollars. And so you and I pay lower taxes because we've historically gotten these lower interest rates, but we may not be getting that anymore. And it's all because global markets don't really trust the US as a safe place to put your money anymore.
So given all this, final question, more of a political question. The right to tariff on the part of a president of the United States is not enumerated in the Constitution. It's not a creature of the Constitution. It's a creature of statute. And what the Congress give it, the Congress can take it away. There's been some movement in that regard. Two questions, then I'll let you go. One, should that power, in the form that it exists now for a president, be trimmed? And B, do you think it will be?
So it's a great question, really important. Congress owns tariff policy. It just gave it away to the president for no reason whatsoever. So on the should question, realize that these tariffs are arguably the largest tax increase on the American people in 50 years. Should one person be able to make tax policy with the stroke of a pen? I believe we had a revolution about that at some point. My answer is no. Your listeners are welcome to have a different answer. If you think this one person is magnificent and you're really confident that all future presidents will be equally level-headed, maybe you'd say it's a good idea. But I would like to see a little more congressional oversight. I think the important point I want to leave your listeners with is that's where this ends and that's where your power lies, which is if the public is sufficiently unhappy, we can make it absolutely clear to our elected congressional representatives that their jobs depend on bringing the king back under control and taking the reins of tariff policy again. I think that's the single best remedy we have here, and that's why I'm going to keep talking out about it, because I think that's the only way forward here.
What happened?
We saw a little bit of a back down this week.
So maybe it will. Professor Justin Wolfers, thank you so much for being with us and explaining things so clearly. Really appreciate it.
A pleasure, Preet.
Hey, stay tuned, viewers. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you're enjoying the show, consider joining Cafe Insider. You'll get exclusive content, including me and Joyce Vance breaking down the latest headlines. Just head to cafe.com/insider to learn more.